this is, over the past 3 years, we have had to cut money out of the public school budget, and over the course of 3 years, those cuts now total $1 billion. And remember, just a moment ago, I was all proud that this year's School Finance Act provides $40 million above growth and inflation. That's $40 million towards the restoration of a $1 billion cut. Or we replaced 4% of the money that we cut. We've got 96% of the way to go, and that's what this ballot issue in November would be about.
Just to get us back to Alabama level.
Right, exactly. You know, the civil unions bill passed. People have been having civil unions for over 2 weeks now. I got to officiate one yesterday. I've been told that Denver is now over 300 couples that have done this in the first 2 weeks. Boulder's over 100. Some of the other bigger counties have seen quite a few. So I'm figuring at this point there's well over 1,000 people, and by the end of the month it'll probably be a few thousand people that have entered into a legally recognized civil union to protect their relationships here. School finance, let's see, I also mentioned, trying to do this off the top of my head, healthcare. A lot went on healthcare this year, but the 2 bills that I sponsored were about funding the exchange, which is going to start operating actually in the fall for coverage that takes effect in January once the individual mandate of Obamacare goes into effect. The exchange is going to be this marketplace where you can go online and actually shop for health insurance for people that have to buy it, and access some of the tax credit subsidies that are going to be available for people who qualify because of lower income. And so you're really going to be able to make important comparisons between different kinds of health policies and really understand what you're paying for and what you're getting. It's going to take, they've been working on this for a while. It's going to take a little bit of money to get this up and running. It's pretty high tech. It's a lot of online services and a lot of coordination with a lot of different insurance carriers. Funding this is something that's going to happen because we are winding down a program called Cover Colorado. Aren't you familiar with Cover Colorado?
Yes.
It's a state high-risk pool for people that had pre-existing conditions that made them uninsurable in the eyes of the insurance industry. The industry wouldn't touch them. Private carriers wouldn't insure these folks. So we created a high-risk pool at the state level and provided state subsidies to that. That's going to end next year because federal health care reform says it doesn't matter if you have a pre-existing condition, insurance companies must cover you. And hopefully by forcing everybody into the pool, everybody into the exchange or some other plan, we start to see risk pooled across bigger groups. Some of these high-risk folks will hopefully be able to, the plan is they will be able to access more affordable private commercial insurance through the exchange. So we passed a bill to wind down the Cover Colorado program and switch a lot of its funding mechanisms over to funding the exchange. So hopefully there's a fairly seamless transition that occurs for folks between those 2 health plans. Those are 2 bills I worked on with Beth McCann, who actually I'm on my way to House District 8 next. They meet today too, and I'll see her there. She's chairing one of the health committees in the House. And so she was a real key person in implementing healthcare reform issues this year. So was Irene Aguilar, who, I don't know, is Irene not going to be here today?
She's not here.
Okay. Irene carried the bill to expand Medicaid that Speaker Ferrandino was the House sponsor on. And she also had another really key, 2 other really key health insurance bills to just align our current insurance laws with the federal healthcare reform and to also reform what's called stop-loss insurance. But if you look at all these things we've done to implement the exchange and phase out Cover Colorado, align our health insurance statutes, reform the way the small group market is working right now through the stop-loss reform, and then expand the Medicaid program, Colorado is way out in front of leading the charge to implement the Affordable Care Act, and you should be really, really pleased with what came out of the legislature this year on health care. One of my other big issues, you've probably heard me talk about before, criminal justice reform. We had a great year on criminal justice reform. One of the biggest bills I sponsored this year was a complete rewrite of the criminal code sentencing laws for drug offenses. I've been working on this drug policy task force for 4 years now. We've been incrementally trying to reform how we approach drug offenders, and when folks have addiction as the driving force behind their criminal conduct, prison really isn't necessarily the most cost-effective intervention, and so we're trying to change policy a little bit to promote community-based drug treatment over incarceration. And Senate Bill 250 is a big step in doing that, big reform of how the whole sentencing system is going to work on drug offenses. And it does create savings in out years in which we're not putting people in prison, and so fewer prison beds are going to be occupied, and all of those savings are recaptured in the budget and reinvested back into drug treatment services for folks that are ordered into community-based drug treatment programs, placed on probation or in community corrections sort of settings, shifting the resources from prison to treatment. I also carried the bill this year about crimes against pregnant women. I don't know if you remember, there's been some really awful cases. We have some laws in the books right now that say if you beat up a pregnant woman and cause her to miscarry and lose the pregnancy, that's a crime in Colorado today. But if you did not know she was pregnant, it's not a crime. Well, it may be an assault, but it's not a crime related to her pregnancy. And where this comes up a lot is in drunk driving accidents or other careless driving accidents, when the drunk driver doesn't know who's the passenger in the car that they've hit, who was the passenger or driver. And so there's no way to prove in those sorts of cases you knew you were assaulting a pregnant woman. You should have had a different standard of care. And so those kind of cases were kind of escaping justice. They were being prosecuted as vehicular assaults. If the woman survived and the car accident, but her pregnancy did not, there was really not an adequate way to prosecute these cases. And so we did, working with some attorneys that do reproductive rights work, friends of mine that I've known for years, did a complete overhaul on all the criminal laws regarding unlawful termination of pregnancy. And as you might imagine, that comes right up to the line of having a big fat abortion debate on the floor of the legislature. That's not what the bill's about. The bill's really careful to exclude any interaction with healthcare services. It also expressly says that the fetus is not a person, in keeping with what Colorado voters have twice said in constitutional amendments that we've rejected on fetal personhood. So the fetus is not the victim of the crime. The pregnant woman is the victim of the crime, and the crime was terminating her pregnancy. Turned into a big, kind of ugly abortion debate, but actually it passed the House with really strong bipartisan support, and then passed the Senate on a completely party line vote. I don't know what I did. But it's really interesting.
Who the sponsor?
It's really interesting the way the culture in the House and the Senate can be really different on certain issues. And boy, this one was just completely polarized. But it's really important, and district attorneys from across the state have supported it and told stories about cases that have happened in their jurisdictions where they weren't really able to adequately prosecute the kind of harm that resulted from these accidents or from these criminal acts. And so that's a big accomplishment. It's something that was not a lot of fun to move through the legislature and have to talk about the kinds of cases, and then have the opponents just want to talk about fetal personhood and why we should be criminalizing abortion and how abortion is the real crime. Not a lot of fun, but it was something that needed to be done. That's a really important accomplishment. Tax policy. The Speaker passed a really great bill, and I have a related bill on internet sales tax. Have you all heard of the Marketplace Fairness Act? This is a bill pending in Congress, would give the states jurisdiction to tax online transactions. There's several things states need to do to be ready for implementation of that federal law, and in Colorado we have one of the worst, most disjointed, convoluted sales tax structures of anywhere in the country. And so Speaker Ferrandino passed a bill that would set up sales tax for online transactions if the Marketplace Fairness Law passes. And I had a bill that I worked on with bipartisan support to set up a study of the disparities between local governments' tax bases. And this is things like what's exempt from sales tax and what's subject to sales tax. Do you remember a few years ago during the economic downturn, the state started charging sales tax on candy bars and soda pop? Used to be that groceries were exempt from tax at the state level, and they still are, except for candy and soda. But in many local jurisdictions, they do tax groceries. or they don't tax, or they still don't tax candy and soda when the state does. And so this study is really looking at the disparities in what's included in the tax base and what's exempt across all local jurisdictions that have a sales tax. And the reason this is important is to implement the Marketplace Fairness Act, we need to get to a point where we have a unified base and a central collection system. And that's going to be a big fight with cities and counties, but at least having this study in place and showing us where's the work that needs to be done to simplify our tax code and get ready for the future of what sales tax is going to look like, really important on tax policy. One of the other bills I carried with Lois Court, Representative Court from House District 6, takes the SCFD, the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District. You know, they have a 0.1% sales tax here in the metro counties, and the RTD, and I can't remember how much theirs is up to, we keep raising it.
I think it's
1.2 or...
Was it over 1 now?
Or is, okay, or is it 0.8? Okay, so it's RTD sales tax and SCFD. They're both these 7 county, sales tax districts that support different services, transit or arts and culture. We standardized their sales tax base to be equal to that of the state's, and it's one of the ones that the state can control through statute that wouldn't require a local vote, and it's like the first step towards trying to get to this marketplace fairness and readiness point where we're all taxing and exempting the same things. The good news in this is that meant candy bars and soda pop became taxable for RTD and the SCFD. They lost a couple things. They had to exempt some things that they were taxing, so there was a trade-off both directions, but it's a small net gain in revenue to both of those districts. The RTD folks are really excited. They think they're going to see $2 or $3 million a year in the first year in increased sales tax collections just from probably candy bars and soda pop.
And our fat youth.
And then the last thing, just on sort of my little list I'm talking about, is just we did some things this year just about good government, whether it was things around the open records law or increasing the state's reserves. This is a budget committee initiative the governor asked us to take on. We increased the amount that the state holds in reserve in the general fund from 4% of all appropriations to 5%. And that's sort of the cushion in our budget, or it's our rainy day fund for when revenues decline. We purposely keep an amount in reserve in the general fund, and we've been running really low historically. We don't reserve a lot. We'd like to get it higher than 5, but just going from 4 to 5 was a big step, and it's just an example of some really financially prudent things that we did in this year's budget. One other bill I carried with Representative Ferrandino is reforming his SMART Act law. Do you remember him talking about, he gave it that name, and state measurements for accountable and responsive and transparent government, something like that. I never liked laws with cute names. This was Mark's big initiative from a couple years ago, and he tried to really legislate and improve the interactions between the legislative branch of government and the executive branch and all the state departments. And we've lived under it for 2 years, and it's been a little convoluted and a little time consuming. And so this year we came in with a bill and really streamlined how we're going to spend some of our time during the legislative session, and we actually moved some work into January and December before the session starts to sort of front load a little bit of the work we need to do to hold and have accountability and oversight hearings with various state departments when they come before legislative committees. And so just as the Joint Budget Committee right now starts meeting in November and December and having budget hearings, we've moved some of the SMART Act stuff out of the session to save a little time during session, and then we've really streamlined it. And I think it's going to be a lot more popular over the next 2 years than it was in its first 2 years. And this was something Mark worked really hard on this year. He started the bill in the House, and I just got to carry it through the Senate, although he's a little mad at me because when he sent the bill to the Senate from the House, it was, I think, 79 pages, and we did an amendment that took out 54 pages. We made it a lot more streamlined and simple. But it's an example of just some things we did internally to really try to be more functional and make better use of our time, better use of taxpayer resources, and how the legislature does its job in exercising those checks and balances against the executive branch. So that's just a really fast drive-by of some of the bills I carried this year. I've got a good list on my website, or if you're on my email newsletter, you've seen those. Let me just rattle off some of the other really big accomplishments of this year. Asset in-state tuition for kids regardless of immigration status. Another one of those unfinished business things that everybody knew needed to be done this year, and we got it done this year. That and civil unions, a couple other things. It feels really good. Election law. We passed a wonderful, massive overhaul of election law in Colorado that's going to include same-day voter registration, mail ballots for everyone, easier election administration for county clerks, savings for counties in their costs of administering elections. The County Clerks Association was fully on board with this. All the election law organizations and advocacy groups fully on board, with a few minor exceptions, and of course Scott Gessler and the Colorado Republican Party not really wild about making it easier for people to register and vote. It probably tells you a lot right there. And for our party and for our values and the way we believe in participation and letting people's voices be heard, this is a wonderful piece of policy, and hopefully we're going to see really good things come from it. Higher participation, more people showing up, not missing deadlines, and being fenced out of the electoral process because of some registration deadline or something to do with paperwork or active, inactive, all that kind of stuff, all got fixed. Major election overhaul, and it's a big deal. I already mentioned Medicaid expansion. Let me talk about renewable energy real quick. You may have seen these ads on television. We took the renewable energy portfolio standard. For Xcel Energy, they're now supposed to, by the year 2030, have, by 2020, have 30% of their total power that they generate and sell be produced by renewable energy sources. And they're well on their way to meeting that standard. Well, Xcel is a regulated monopoly. There are other electric utilities that don't fit under that model and weren't subject to the same expectation. And mainly those are rural electric cooperatives. And these folks have, they want to build new coal-burning plants, and they still want to live in the 19th century, I think. They've been kicking and screaming about any kind of renewable mandate, and they were already subject to a 10%, and it was doubled this year to 20% in Senate Bill 252. And that's what those commercials you see on television are, ask the governor to veto this bill, it's so terrible, we can't burn coal, we're going to have to put more wind on our energy grid. For me, this is really an issue about getting with the future. We can't keep burning fossil fuels and thinking that that's going to run everything that we need, all the power we need. And it's going to take mandates like this for behavior in the private market, in these electric utilities and co-ops and the power companies that supply them. It's going to take some nudging and some prodding and some government mandates maybe to get them to invest in the right direction for the future and put more renewable energy into use and have less greenhouse gas emission and environmental impacts from our voracious appetite for energy. So that's a big bill, huge fight as that went through. What am I forgetting?
Guns.
Guns! You guys have heard a lot about the gun debate. This is actually something I do want to talk about. One, the things we passed were all things that had really strong voter support in polling. People really understand the value of a background check. And the idea that there were some gun sales going on that weren't subject to a background check, and if you went to the gun show or you went to the gun dealer, you were going to have a background check. So why go there when you could just go to a garage sale or go to Craigslist and go through a private sale and avoid that? It was a huge loophole in the background check system that we closed. Hopefully we see some changes in public safety. Hopefully we don't see quite as many incidents where the wrong people got their hands on guns and shot a bunch of other folks. But those kind of random violent things you're never going to absolutely be able to control. But the more you do to make it unlikely that deadly weapons end up in the wrong hands, the safer we're all going to be. And so I think voters, by and large, support this. I think there are a lot of pockets of people that are really angry about it. You know, they drove circles around the Capitol one whole day honking their horns on their cars. And now they're out in 4 different legislative districts carrying recall petitions to recall some of the folks that supported these. And unfortunately, 3 of the recalls that have been filed are on Senate Democrat members. 1 is on a House member. But when you just look at this politically, the state Senate is probably the most competitive, most challenging thing we've got on the ballot in this next election cycle. The way the reapportionment maps work for the State House, it's looking really good that we can maintain Democratic majorities in the House for the rest of the decade under that map. The Senate is highly competitive and could flip back and forth every 2 years over that same time period. And so I think the fact that 3 of the 4 recall petitions were filed against senators is no accident, and it's really just trying to destabilize some of the incumbents that we have, and also just drain resources for protecting incumbents now through the recall process, and so that we have less money to play defense in the 2014 election cycle. So some of this I think is just really cold calculating politics, and it's probably a pretty good strategy on their part, and we're taking it very seriously. And so as you, as Democratic activists, spend some time this summer, whether you're fundraising or looking for candidates to help or things to get involved in, don't be surprised if there isn't a call to action for us all to mobilize and maybe go help Senator Evie Hudak up in North Jefferson County. She could be subject to recall. Senator John Morse in central Colorado Springs and Manitou Springs. We're very concerned about that seat. It's a very historically low voter turnout seat. A lot of military base and people, a lot of high mobility of people moving in and out of the district. Not a lot of people vote in that district, and as a result, the threshold for how many recall petitions it takes to force an election is very low in Senator Morse's district. So the likelihood that they're going to get their signatures and that we're going to see a recall set in motion in Colorado Springs is real high. And then the third one is Senator Hiron in Pueblo. So between the 3 of those seats, if all 3 of them were recalled and replaced with Republicans, we'd be in the minority and there'd be a Republican majority come January. That's how serious this is, and it's just not a great position to be in going into next year's election cycle when we know 14 is going to be a real challenge for the Senate. So if you get invited to a fundraiser, if you get asked to go volunteer, if you're looking for a volunteer project, we may have some work for you starting next month in some of these recall races. Did you have a question?
CNN was just reporting yesterday that the NRA was behind the Morse recall and that they're going to fund it big time, so we have to have his back.
Yeah, and it's not just the NRA, but there's some other anti-gun control groups, this Rocky Mountain gun owners, that they're absolutely crazy. And there's some wealthy donors that are funneling some money. I mean, we can't, there's someone who said that they're responsible for some of this, but they've been funneling the money through some nonprofit groups. And with recall elections, it's different than candidate elections. You're not subject to the same candidate campaign finance laws, because it's actually a yes/no question on the ballot. Should this person be recalled? And so you run an issue committee, and the finance rules for issue committees are very, very different than they are for partisan races or candidate committees. And so that's another disturbing part of this, is there's going to be a lot of secret money that's much easier to spend in issue campaigns like this. So maybe on both sides. Yeah, you're right. Let me start taking some questions. Yeah.
Thanks for all the hard work you do, Pat. Just a quick question on, where you caught the state money when you've got this rainy day fund, and then secondarily, have you guys ever considered a state bank like the communist state of North Dakota does?
I've heard a lot of talk about the state bank. Someone was going to introduce that a year or 2 ago, and somebody discouraged them from doing it. I can't remember the whole backstory. I was kind of interested in the issue because of work I've done around regulation on marijuana. And one of the biggest problems with the marijuana industry in our state is that they can't bank through the normal banking system. And the amount of cash that they're sitting on and cash transactions that they're doing really is, you know, creating a pretty attractive situation for armed robberies and things. And there's been some of that that's happened. They've tried to really keep it out of the news because they don't want more people getting the idea. But the banking problem for them is really serious. And I was wondering if the state bank would help. In my research, I've decided there really isn't a solution to the marijuana banking issue at the state capitol in Denver. The solution is in federal law in Washington, and Jared Polis is working on that with some other folks. I wish we could do something here. And I'm sorry, what was the first part of the
Oh,
question?
when you put the state fund this way,
What is it?
the rainy day fund, where does that money
Oh,
sit?
It
And
stays
can
in
you
the...
put it in a local bank as opposed to a Chase bank or something?
Oh, I see, okay. The money sits actually just in the general fund. It's just money in the general fund that doesn't get spent and is reserved. Wells Fargo is who has the account for the state of Colorado. So yeah, we're with one of the big banks and not one of the better ones. And there's been a lot of talk about, can we force a change on that? We haven't done it, you know, and there's reasons why it's something you shouldn't do lightly or just cause. Could it be invested better? That's a different question. You know, the state treasurer, Walker Stapleton, is in charge of the treasury and investing the state accounts. He, well, lots of things you can say about Walker. I actually saw him last night for the first time in months. We did have a bill go through this year about investing in bonds issued by the Israeli government. But as far as, you know, how the state treasury is invested, I think that's the only policy change this year. But we could, you know, there's a lot you could do there. There's also a lot of risk in doing some of that. So some of it's, is it broken?
I understand you had misgivings early on about the Fort Lyons project. I don't know if those were addressed or if you still have concerns.
Fort Lyon was a VA hospital. It was originally built as a tuberculosis sanitarium in the late 1800s. It's in Bent County, which is between La Junta and Lamar, near the town of Los Alamos, which is not located in Los Alamos County. That's quite a ways away. We received the property about 12 years ago from the federal government. They deeded it to us so that we could turn it into a prison. And the state ran it for a decade as a prison for geriatric and acute medical inmates. And so it was more like a hospital. It was a low security facility. These guys were on walkers and oxygen tanks. You know, they weren't going to escape. No, that's the face of our prison population. They're getting older, grayer, and sicker. And this was a facility specifically to treat, so, you know, high medical need patients. But the facility, because of its age, was so expensive to operate. As we've been dealing with the problem of declining prison populations, that was a really easy candidate for closure. We've actually closed several prisons over the past several years, and we're probably going to have to keep doing that. But the governor, Hickenlooper, one of his first decisions in office when he first took over in 2011 was to go ahead and act on the recommendation that we close Fort Lyon. And so we closed the prison. He was brand new in office. He probably didn't handle it as well as he could have because it's a very politically sensitive issue, some of these prisons in rural communities, because they're the largest employer in the county. They're a huge part of the tax base when you talk about income and economic activity. It was a big impact on Bent County. And we knew that, you know, and we knew there was other hard decisions that are going to be coming around prison closures. And it's sort of unfortunate that, you know, your town's economic future got hitched to the prison industry, whether it's a state prison or a private prison, because there's a lot of the private prisons are in very awkward locations. And I think they do that on purpose so that if you don't contract with them and pay them an adequate amount, they get an entire county to scream at you that you're, you know, suffocating and starving the county. That's going on right now in Burlington. Burlington, Colorado has a big private prison. There's been fewer and fewer inmates going to the private prison, so they've been laying off, and the town is getting crankier and crankier about it. And we're going to go through, in Burlington, in all likelihood, sometime next year or the year after, what we've been through in Fort Lyon. So the governor, after he closed Fort Lyon, sort of made a promise to the community he would find another use for the facility. And he did a lot of things to try to figure out another use, including trying to get the federal government to take it back over, which they refused. Finally, they decided they want to turn it into a treatment center for homeless people with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. The Budget Committee has not been supportive of this throughout this whole process, mainly just because of concerns about the facility and the operating costs. There's a lot of asbestos, so any remodeling you do anywhere turns into a big asbestos abatement issue. But the facility, the age of the facility, in particular the physical plant, the heating, water treatment, plumbing, are all really old and need a whole lot of work. And the utility bills on the facility were about $1.7 million a year. And so we looked at this as sort of a pilot program. You know, should the state offer residential treatment to homeless people? You know, that's an interesting question, and actually I think the state does very little to help the homeless. It's primarily a local government responsibility. Yeah. City and County of Denver, big impact. Colorado Springs, big impact. But the state doesn't really operate homeless programs. It's a local government responsibility in Colorado so far. And from our perspective, starting the state in the business of being a homeless service provider, or at least contracting for those services, was, you know, that you can have a debate over whether we should or not, and actually I'm very interested in seeing what the state can do better to serve and prevent homelessness in Colorado. I you know, very willing to enter into that conversation. It's just, why are you piloting an untested program in this faraway location with these really high overhead costs and all of these problems with the physical plant? And so the Budget Committee opposed it. And it became a big fight sort of between the Joint Budget Committee and the Governor's Office, which is always healthy for both of us. I say that seriously. You know, we did a lot of things working hand in hand with the Governor's Office on the budget this year. You know, the Governor, I think, had a very, very good reception for his budget requests in the Budget Committee this year. This is the one thing we were crossways with him on. And ultimately they had to do some pretty fast political maneuvering in the legislature to find a way to revive and pass this Fort Lyon plan. But it did pass, and now that it's passed, we're committing a couple $1 million to redoing all the HVAC in all these buildings down there, decoupling them all from a centralized old boiler that they were on, which is one of the reasons it was so inefficient. But the amount of asbestos abatement you have to do in the process of digging up and changing all these boiler pipes and everything to heat the buildings, we're going to sink a lot of money. Yeah. And one of the things that's not talked about a lot is the request the governor made was for just a little less than $3 million in the first year for this place. But actually, that was $3 million out of the general fund. There's another $5 million that they're going to sink into the Fort Lyon facility that comes from the settlement that the states did when we sued the mortgage processing industry and Citywide or what are it Countrywide and all those folks. There's 4 or 5 big mortgage firms that were sued by all the states. We got a big settlement. Money came in that was supposed to be used for housing related costs, and some of how the state's going to use some of that settlement money is $5 million right off the bat into Fort Lyon to fix the boilers and physical plant issues and some other things. So, I mean, this is not an inexpensive model, and we're not really sure whether it's going to succeed or not, and whether or not folks are going to want to voluntarily go to Fort Lyon, you know, 3.5 hours from Denver and be bused back and forth. If they're really going to stick with the treatment program, you know, they're not court ordered, they're not in the criminal justice system, they're not committed to stay in this program. It's a voluntary placement, and there's going to be a transportation service every day back and forth from Denver, Colorado Springs, and Fort Lyon, just sort of moving people around, taking people down there that want to check in and bringing people back that want to check out. And so just how this is going to work remains to be seen, but the decision was made this year to go ahead and invest in the Fort Lyon facility. And now that we're in, you know, if we're going to go ahead and do this to the boilers and do this with the asbestos and do the things that need to be done to get the buildings a little more up to shape, it's like, okay, all in. You know, is chronic homeless, co-occurring disorder population the only folks that would make sense to be there? Because there's over 500 beds in several big, huge dorm-looking buildings on this campus. And so now I'm beginning to wonder, What other sorts of programs maybe should we locate there? They're similar, you know. We don't have a lot of residential drug treatment at all in this state. We don't have a lot of civil commitment beds for people with mental illness. And we could expand the state hospital. There's a lot of things we could do, and if we're going to make this initial investment to bring this property a little bit more in line and affordable to operate, I'm interested in. So I think that's going to become the next round of the discussion. We got over the initial hump. We're going to invest in Fort Lyon and turn it into something at taxpayer expense or money from this mortgage settlement. Let's make sure we do the right thing and serve as many people as we can. That's where I'm at today on that. There's several hands on this.
So who's going to run it?
Actually, it's kind of a sole source contract sort of deal with the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. The Bent County is going to be very involved, and they're going to have some money on the line as well. Bent County is saying they're going to offer the transportation services, but the budget and plans for that haven't worked out yet. And I question how much Bent County can really afford to absorb in the costs here, because they're a small, poor, rural county. But Coalition for the Homeless is going to have a contract to operate it and do the actual services. They're going to move staff down there, and they're going to live there as well. Some of their staff. I mean, they may end up, you know, buying homes or
The
renting.
staff doesn't include a physician, though, does it?
I don't know that.
It's my understanding they're going to rely on emergency services in Bend County, that they'll have
Yeah.
nursing, but they won't.
And there are some other services and things in Bent County they can tap into. Otero Community College is right next door to Fort Lyon, and so as far as educational programming and opportunities, you know, there's a lot of things that can come together to make this work. It's just the initial investment was something the Budget Committee was really kind of having a hard time with, but the rest of the legislature decided that for us.
You kind of answered my question, which was, are there going to be caregivers in the substance abuse world there? And
Yes.
that seems like a natural follow-on. I guess that's not the initial plan, but
Well, no, it is part of the, I mean, and specifically the population they're looking at are these co-occurring, you know, chronically homeless people, generally men. At first it's going to be just men, and they're going to wait to bring in a unit or a floor that'll be occupied by women. But right now it's men with mental illness and substance use disorders, and they're a really tough population to serve. And which is why, are they going to stick with it? Are they going to not like it there and want to be on the next bus back
and
to
are they
Denver?
going to be able to find caregivers to go down there and live in
Yeah.
Fort Lyon?
Yeah, well, you know, Fort Lyon it's been a VA hospital and a prison hospital and a tuberculosis sanitarium. The place has a long history of being, you know, an intensive residential care kind of facility. So the community has some history there. They also haven't had any jobs there for a couple of years, and so some of those people have moved to find another job. And whether we can get people to move back to that rural community with the kind of skills and everything, that'll be something we're gonna have to see how that works. Yes.
So I happen to sit on the Colorado Energy Coalition, and this is a question about Senate Bill 252. And there was some comments at my last meeting that the legislature did not reach out at all to the rural electric community about the details of this bill. Can you debunk that a little bit for me,
Well,
please?
I may not be the person in the best position to do that, because I wasn't the sponsor of this, and I had lots of other things I was busy with. I can tell you that there is a long-standing history of the environmental community and the rural electric associations not being able to talk to each other. And so I've heard a lot of different stories about, you know, we offered to sit down with you, we told
Right,
you this was
that's
coming.
right.
You know, the governor's office was very involved in some of this, and I can't believe that they blindsided the REAs. I think the REAs just kept thumbing their nose at everyone saying, no how, no way, not going to talk, not going to put up with this, and they refused to ever have any kind of conversation or negotiation
Okay,
about
so
it.
there's a little bit.
That's the version of the story I know from the proponent side, but I do know enough of the personalities involved that I think both sides, you know, neither side has clean hands, let's say, in how we treated each other.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that was really difficult about the inside the building politics on that bill.
Do you have any sense of when, if the governor's going to sign it?
I believe he will. The governor's office was involved in negotiating and moving that bill through the process the entire way.
Okay.
And I think some of what you're hearing now about we're considering it, we're looking at it, we're listening, is because there's this television ad campaign bombarding the state about this bill right now. And so I think they're not wanting to look too strident about the fact, but they've been on board with this bill from the beginning. Barry?
Just a real quick one, the elder community,
Well, you need to get out of here. Last question.
well, the elder community had some bills come through, specifically 127, and the joint budget decided in their wisdom that there wasn't enough money for the initial bill, so we swallowed a 50% cut on the permanent increase. What are we doing about the rest of that money that is needed for the AAAs and for the ARP programs, and for, what is it, we're approaching 1 out of every 5 voters is a senior. And so I think it's politically expedient. We're not a big enough voice, I don't think, yet. But,
Well,
you know,
remember, and I explained this, I think, 2 months ago when I was here, the senior area agencies on aging, all of the, we call them the AAAs, but they're area agencies that serve elders, they came forward with a proposal to increase funding for the Older Coloradans Act by $4 million a year, and to stair-step it up, $4 million increase for 3 years, so $12 million increase over 3 years. The Budget Committee trimmed that back. It's true, I was responsible for that. And actually, we provided $4 million worth of increase in the budget. That's 1 year funding. We did amend the bill to guarantee them a $2 million level, going forward, but we preserved the flexibility to continue doing it 1 year at a time, or to make these decisions, 1 year at a time, rather than schedule it all in law now. Because if the economy were to go bad and we were to start making budget cuts again, we'd have to pass another bill to undo those scheduled increases, and that would not be a popular bill to vote on at all. And so that's just one of the things you have to do on the Budget Committee, is play bad guy and kind of pour cold water on some things and say, 1 year at a time here, folks. Let's not overcommit ourselves. Let's not overcommit ourselves 2 or 3 years out in the future when we don't know what the economic situation is going to be. At this point, I expect fully that we will go above $12 million in those services next year, which is, this year they're at 12. And so I'm hoping we can increase them again next year and continue to do that, and maybe even bump up that minimum guaranteed number in statute. But for the most part, people were really happy with how that turned out. I know it's not what they aimed for, but they still got a big increase, and there's a lot more awareness about that. And their guaranteed minimum increased as well. And so I don't think there's a downside to what we did. It's just it wasn't quite everything they wished for.
well, just recognizing the cost of the services is also going up, just like other sectors have already done.
And that pays for Meals on Wheels and medical transportation for folks that can't drive to the doctor's office and things. Really important to help seniors remain independent and stay at home. You just reminded me, one other group I want to talk about really quick that did well in the budget, or did well in the legislature this year, is actually we did a lot on immigration issues. Asset was really just the beginning. We repealed a law called Senate 190. This is a law that was passed back during the special session, or 2006, right before the special session.
This is the Protect Ritter Act.
Yeah, it was, and it was this law that said anytime law enforcement pulls somebody over, or has an encounter with a citizen, if there's reason to think they may be undocumented, you could ask for their papers and then detain them. And so it was this really kind of show me your papers sort of law, and it was actually leading to a lot of inefficiency for local law enforcement. And so the police and the sheriffs supported getting rid of this law. Since then, we've had the Secure Communities initiative come from the feds. There's been some other changes. This law was kind of old and punitive. We repealed it. And then we passed a law that will allow undocumented folks an opportunity to get a state driver's license. And there's quite a bit of process they need to go through and things they need to prove, minimum amount of residency here. But getting folks positively ID'd so that when there is a car accident, you know who's been involved. Or maybe now that they have a driver's license, they'll actually have car insurance, so that when there's a car accident, it all gets handled the normal way that we're all used to, with insurance companies dealing with each other. It's a huge step forward. And so not only, for immigrant populations, do we end this policy of show me your papers, prove to us who you are when we know you can't. Now it's prove to us who you are, and we're making it possible for you to have ID just like everybody else and participate, in the same way in simple things like driving on our streets to and from work or the grocery store or wherever. those are some really important things that the immigrant and Latino community are really aware of, that happened in this year's legislative session. And I think as we go forward and we talk about, how we're going to keep organizing our Democratic Party and bringing more people in to join us, just realize that, for seniors, for LGBT people, for Latinos, for so many different groups that are part of our base constituency, this year's legislative session was a huge success, and there's a lot to show for it, a lot of stuff we can organize around to build a stronger party.
And it can hold